Greetings. In this video, you will hear the most interesting and scary 5 horror stories. If you like these stories, you can subscribe so you don't lose my channel. Enjoy watching. The Unknown Caller. It started as a typical Thursday evening. Rachel sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, catching up on social media. She was alone in her apartment. Her roommate had gone out with friends, leaving Rachel with the place to herself. The weather outside was grim, the wind howling, and the rain tapping against the windows. It was the kind of night that made her want to curl up with a blanket and binge-watch her favorite shows. Then, her phone rang. It wasn't a call she recognized, just an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment, then decided to answer. Maybe it was a telemarketer or some kind of scam, but she was bored, so she picked up anyway. Hello? There was silence on the other end, a deep, unsettling silence. It lasted a few seconds before a voice broke through. Rachel. She froze, the blood draining from her face. It wasn't anyone she knew. The voice was hoarse, almost whispering, and it seemed to echo in her ears, even though the volume was low. "Who is this?" she asked, her heart pounding. "How do you know my name?" The voice didn't respond. It just repeated her name, softly but chillingly. Rachel. She ended the call abruptly, feeling a strange sense of unease crawling up her spine. It was probably a prank, but something didn't feel right. She tried to shrug it off, telling herself she was overreacting, and returned to scrolling through her phone. But then it happened again. A second call, from the same unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat. She stared at the screen, her finger hovering over the reject button. She hesitated, and before she could make up her mind, the phone rang again. Rachel. The voice was clearer this time, almost as if it were speaking directly into her ear, though she hadn't even answered the call yet. It was as if the voice knew she would pick up. Terrified, Rachel answered, her voice shaking. "Who is this?" The response came almost immediately. "Look outside." Rachel's stomach dropped. What did that mean? She glanced nervously around her apartment. It was dark outside, and the rain still fell in heavy sheets. She could barely make out the silhouette of a figure standing by the window across from her apartment, shrouded in the rain. Her breath caught in her throat. She could see no one. But the voice, it had spoken again, this time sounding closer. "I'm watching you." Her hands trembled as she ended the call, but the fear didn't go away. She rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the rain and the emptiness of the night. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. Rachel locked the window, bolted the door, and settled back onto the couch, trying to calm herself. It was just a prank, she told herself again. She was being paranoid. But that's when the text started. "You can't hide." It wasn't from any number she recognized. No name, just a string of cold, haunting words. She didn't reply. She didn't want to engage with whatever sick game this person was playing. But then her phone rang again. Her stomach dropped. She looked at the screen. It was the same unknown number. This time, she didn't answer. The ringing continued, relentless, as though the person on the other end knew that by simply calling over and over, they could break her down. Rachel's fingers hovered over her phone. Something inside her wanted to answer, but she knew deep down that it would only make things worse. And then it stopped. For an entire hour, there was no ringing, no message, just silence. She allowed herself to breathe again, thinking it was over. Maybe they had given up, gone away. But just as she thought the nightmare was behind her, the phone rang once more. This time, she answered. The voice on the other end was no longer a whisper. It was a scream so loud, so guttural, that Rachel had to pull the phone away from her ear. "Get out!" the voice shrieked. "Get out now!" The scream reverberated through her entire body, sending her into a panic. She scrambled for her coat, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Her apartment felt cold, too cold. The walls seemed to close in around her, suffocating her. As she turned to run for the door, she heard it again. The voice, softer this time. Not a scream, but a whisper. It was coming from inside her phone, louder than ever before. "Rachel, I'm inside." Her phone vibrated violently in her hand. The lights flickered, and in the reflection of her phone screen, she saw it, a shadow moving behind her. Frozen with terror, Rachel spun around. There was no one there, but she knew, with every fiber of her being, that the voice wasn't just in her phone. It was in the room with her, watching her. As the call ended, she was left with nothing but the sound of her own breath and the realization that whatever was haunting her through the phone was not done yet. The silent caller. Zane had never been a believer in things he couldn't see or touch. Ghosts, spirits, hauntings. They were nothing more than superstition. That was until the day he received the call. It wasn't an ordinary call. At first, it was just the sound of static, a crackling noise that filled his ear. Zane frowned, pulling the phone away from his face to check the screen. But there was no number displayed, just a blank screen and the word "unknown caller." "Hello?" he asked, his voice tentative. Maybe it was a glitch. There was no response, only static, growing louder, until it felt as though the sound was vibrating through his entire body. Then, a voice. But it wasn't just any voice. It was his own. Zane. His blood ran cold. He gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles turning white. The voice was distorted, slowed down, as if it had been dragged through some sort of filter. But it was unmistakably his own. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. "What do you want?" The static intensified, now filling the entire space around him, buzzing like the hum of an electrical wire about to snap. The voice on the other end didn't respond right away, and Zane could hear what sounded like heavy breathing, almost as if someone was standing right next to him. The silence dragged on for what felt like an eternity before the voice returned, this time much clearer, though it was still his own. "Don't pick up the phone again." Zane froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The phone shook in his hands. He was certain he'd heard that voice, but how was it possible? He was the only one in the apartment. Before he could respond, the call abruptly ended. Zane stood there, staring at the screen in disbelief. The room felt colder now, the air thicker, heavier. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He didn't call back. The phone sat on the table in front of him, silent now, but the dread didn't leave. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him, just beyond the screen. Something tied to the call he'd just received. But what was it? And why had it used his own voice? The next day, Zane tried to move on. He told himself it was just some kind of freak accident, a weird glitch in the system, maybe even a prank. He turned his phone off for a while, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. He didn't want to think about it, but deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before the phone would ring again. That night, after another long shift at the office, he returned home and collapsed onto the couch. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Zane stared at the TV but wasn't really watching. The eerie silence pressed in around him, thick and oppressive. Then, as if on cue, his phone rang again. He almost didn't want to answer. He didn't have to. He could just let it go to voicemail. But something urged him to pick it up. His finger hovered over the screen for a moment before he swiped to answer. This time, there was no static, just the sound of heavy breathing. Zane. The voice wasn't distorted anymore. It was clear, too clear, like a shadow creeping behind him. It was his voice, unmistakably his. Zane's stomach churned. "What do you want from me?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Zane thought maybe it was a prankster again, but this felt different. There was something in the tone of his own voice that didn't belong. Then, a soft whisper, almost too quiet to hear. "Look behind you." Zane's blood ran cold. He turned slowly, glancing over his shoulder, his pulse racing. The room was empty, just the same dim apartment, the same quiet stillness. No one was there, but the phone call hadn't ended. His own voice echoed again in his ear, louder now, almost frantic. "Zane, turn around. Turn around now." Zane threw the phone across the room, as if throwing it would somehow stop whatever was happening. The phone crashed against the wall, the screen cracking. The room fell back into silence, but it wasn't the same. Something in the air had changed, something dark had seeped into the walls, and the quiet felt oppressive, like it was waiting for something. He stared at the broken phone on the floor, and for a moment, he thought he saw the screen flicker. He wasn't sure if he imagined it, but when the screen turned black again, Zane felt it. He wasn't alone anymore. He picked up the phone, the crack in the screen now distorted like a dark omen. He opened the messaging app, wanting to check for any signs of the prankster. Maybe they were laughing at him. Maybe it was some strange glitch after all. But the message was there, staring back at him in black text on the broken screen. "I'm already inside." The text was from an unknown number, a number that didn't appear on his contacts list. A cold sweat broke out across Zane's forehead as the phone began to buzz in his hands. The message was followed by a new notification. A video file had been sent. He didn't know why he opened it. He clicked on the file. The screen flickered once more, and as the video began to play, Zane's own face appeared on it. But it wasn't him. It was someone, or something, looking exactly like him, only twisted. The figure in the video smiled in a grotesque way, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide, and then, in his own voice, it said, "You shouldn't have answered." Zane dropped the phone, his heart hammering in his chest. The last thing he heard before the world went black was the sound of his own voice, echoing in the room, repeating over and over again, "I'm inside. I'm inside. I'm inside." The voice from the past. Anna had always been the skeptical type. She was the person who rolled her eyes at ghost stories, who laughed when people spoke of haunted places. The supernatural didn't faze her. She had a scientific mind, after all, and was convinced that everything had a logical explanation. So when she found an old, unmarked phone at the back of a dusty drawer in her new apartment, she thought little of it. It didn't seem like anything more than junk, but it was a curiosity, something from the previous tenants. At first, the phone appeared to be dead. She couldn't get it to turn on no matter how many times she pressed the power button. But then, one evening, after a long day of moving in, she heard it, the faintest chime. Her fingers froze over the phone's surface. It was as if it had just woken up on its own, the screen flickering to life as if it had been waiting for her. Curious, she picked it up and unlocked it with a simple swipe. It wasn't connected to any cellular network, and there was no service to speak of. The messages were all blank, the contacts were empty. But there was something strange about the background photo, a blurry picture of an old house that looked remarkably like hers. She thought it was just a coincidence, or perhaps a photo that had been set up as a default on the phone. But then the calls started. At first, they were nothing too alarming, just static and a broken line. Anna figured it was a faulty connection or an old number still trying to reach someone. But as the days went by, the calls grew more frequent, and the static turned into something more disturbing. Low whispers, fragmented sentences that were barely audible, but unmistakable. "Anna!" She jumped when she heard her name, her heart pounding in her chest. No one knew her new number, and yet, the voice on the other end sounded eerily familiar. It wasn't a stranger's voice, it was her mother's voice. "Mom," Anna said, trembling as she held the phone to her ear. But the voice on the other end didn't answer. Instead, she heard faint laughter, almost like a distant echo of a memory. She felt her stomach turn. The voice sounded like her mother, but it was warped, distorted. Then came the next call. "Don't answer it, Anna." This time, it was clearer. But it wasn't her mother. It was a voice she had never heard before, a low, gravelly tone that chilled her to the core. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as the voice continued. "I'm waiting. You shouldn't have come here." Anna was paralyzed with fear, unable to speak. The voice seemed to know her, as though it had been watching her, following her movements. She slammed the phone down, trying to shake off the sensation of something closing in on her. But the calls didn't stop. Days passed, and the calls came at odd hours, each one more unsettling than the last. The voice would taunt her, whispering things that no one could have known. "You found me. Get out of the house. Don't go upstairs." Anna became obsessed. She couldn't explain how or why these calls were happening, but something about the voice, the repeated messages, gnawed at her. The house was old, sure, but there had to be a rational explanation. Still, every time the phone rang, her stomach turned in dread. One evening, after receiving another eerie message, Anna decided to confront whatever was on the other side of the phone. She had to know the truth, had to end this. She was done with the fear, done with the nightmares. When she answered the phone, the voice on the other end spoke before she could even say a word. "You shouldn't have picked it up." The words sent a cold shiver down her spine. She demanded answers. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The voice didn't respond at first, but then, in a slow, almost menacing tone, it said, "I'm not calling you. I'm calling for you." Suddenly, the phone cut out. The screen went black, and Anna stared at it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What did that mean? Who was calling for her? The phone began to ring again. She answered it, but this time, there was no voice on the other end. There was only the sound of heavy breathing, breathing that grew louder, closer. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps dragging slowly across the floor, as if someone was walking just behind her. The footsteps grew louder, more frantic, until the sound of something crashing to the floor echoed through her apartment. The screen flickered to life again. There, on the screen, was a photo. It was of Anna, standing in her living room, but the picture was old, decades old, as though it had been taken long before she had moved into the apartment. Her heart stopped. The door behind her creaked. The phone screen flickered again, and there, in the reflection, standing just behind her, was a shadowy figure. Anna spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the phone, now silent. The calls stopped, but the phone had changed. It wasn't the same device she had picked up. It was old, cracked, its display darkened as though it had aged years in mere moments. There was a new message on the screen, the last message she would ever read. "I'm inside." The message that wouldn't leave. It was supposed to be a fresh start for Megan. After months of grief, the death of her mother still weighed heavily on her heart, but she was determined to move on. A change of scenery, a new job, and a quiet apartment away from everything familiar seemed like the perfect way to begin again. The apartment was small but cozy, nestled on the top floor of an old building that had seen better days. The rent was cheap, and Megan couldn't resist the charm of the creaky floorboards and the faint smell of old books in the air. She'd taken it without hesitation, eager to put her past behind her. But there was something about the phone. It was an old landline, sitting on a small table in the corner of the living room. When she first moved in, it hadn't worked. The line was dead, just a relic from a bygone era. She had no intention of using it. Why would she, with her modern smartphone in hand? But when she went to plug it in one evening, just to see if it could work again, something strange happened. The phone rang. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a wrong number, or perhaps a glitch in the wiring. But when she picked it up, there was no one on the other end. She waited. The line was silent, but the hairs on her neck stood up. The sound of faint static buzzed in her ear. Megan. Her blood ran cold. The voice was familiar. It was her mother's voice. But how could that be? She had buried her mother only a few months ago. Megan quickly slammed the phone down, heart racing, but the ringing continued. And when she hesitated, unsure of whether to answer, it rang again. "Megan, don't leave." This time, the voice was clearer. It was her mother. But why? Why was she calling? Megan's mind reeled as she stared at the phone. The connection was broken, yet there was something chilling about hearing her mother's voice on the other end. She felt the panic rising inside her, and her feet instinctively carried her to the door, eager to leave the apartment. She wasn't sure what she was running from, but the sense of dread was undeniable. The phone stopped ringing, but then the messages started. Every day, The phone would ring at precisely 8 p.m. Every time Megan picked up, it was the same thing. Her mother's voice, repeating the same words. Don't leave. Don't leave me. The static that followed would drown out the rest of the words, leaving her in a fog of confusion and terror. Each night, she would hesitate before answering, her hand shaking as she picked up the receiver. Sometimes, she wouldn't even answer at all. She'd turn off the ringer, hoping it would stop, but it never did. The messages grew worse. Megan, I'm waiting for you. The phone would ring again. The voice was clearer now, but it wasn't her mother's voice anymore. It had changed, distorted, the voice growing deeper, raspier, like something that didn't belong in her mother's body. One night, Megan could stand it no longer. She knew she had to face whatever this was. Her mind told her to call the police, but something in her gut told her that this wasn't something they could help with. The phone rang again. This time, she answered, but the voice was no longer familiar. You shouldn't have come here. The words were cold, accusatory, as if they weren't meant for her. The voice was grating, twisted. You're mine now. You'll never leave. The line went dead. Megan dropped the phone, her heart hammering in her chest. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, she didn't know what to think. Had it been a dream? Had she imagined it? But when she looked at the screen of her phone, there was a message waiting for her. It was a photo. The photo was of the apartment, but it was different. The walls were darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally. The furniture was displaced, like someone had been searching the rooms, moving things around. And in the corner of the photo, there was a figure. Cloaked in shadows, its face obscured, but unmistakably there. Megan's blood ran cold. She didn't recognize the figure, but the chill in her bones told her everything she needed to know. The phone rang once more. This time, she didn't pick it up. The apartment door suddenly slammed open behind her. The room went cold, and the lights flickered violently. As she turned, she could hear footsteps, slow, dragging across the floor. The heavy breathing, too familiar, echoed in the darkness. From behind her, a voice, no longer her mother's, whispered, I told you, you shouldn't have come back. Megan screamed, but the sound was muffled, as if the walls themselves were swallowing her. The phone continued to ring in the background, as if it were the only thing still alive in the world. The last call. It had been days since Eliza had heard the voice. She couldn't remember the last time she slept through the night without hearing it whispering her name, distant but unmistakable. Every night, it would call to her, soft and haunting, like a distant memory she couldn't escape. It started innocently enough, an odd, unfamiliar phone number. At first, she had simply ignored it. Everyone gets random calls, right? But then, as the days passed, the calls grew more frequent. It wasn't just a single ring here and there, but an unrelenting barrage at odd hours of the day and night. Always the same number, always the same eerie silence before the voice spoke. Eliza. The first few calls, she answered, nervously, almost half-heartedly. The voice would always ask her the same thing. Do you remember me? But Eliza didn't recognize the voice. It didn't belong to anyone she knew, and it certainly didn't belong to anyone she could remember. That's when the images began to appear. At first, it was a blurry picture, a dark, shadowy figure standing in a doorway. Eliza stared at it, trying to make sense of it, but it was too unclear. Then, over the next few days, more pictures came. A silhouette of a person lying on a bed, another of a pair of shoes on a staircase, then another of a street at night, an empty street. And the voice, it was always there, soft and whispering. Eliza, remember me? Remember what we did? It felt like the voice was pulling her in, digging up something deep inside her that she didn't want to find, something she didn't understand. The pictures kept coming, more and more vivid each time. They started to make sense, or at least, they began to feel like they made sense. The figure in the first image wasn't a stranger. It was her. At least, she thought it was. But no, she had never seen these places. She had never been on that staircase, never been down that street at night. The images felt wrong, and the voice felt like a cruel reminder of something she could not fully grasp. The last call was the worst. The phone rang in the dead of night, the shrill noise cutting through the silence like a knife. Eliza tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. With trembling hands, she answered. "Hello?" she asked, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Eliza." This time, the voice wasn't soft or haunting. It was clear, sharp, almost desperate. "You shouldn't have answered the phone." Her heart stopped in her chest. "Who are you?" she demanded. The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, she heard the sounds of breathing, loud, ragged, like someone was right next to her. "I know what you did," the voice said. "I know where you've been." Eliza froze. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her mind racing. The voice didn't respond right away, but there was something in the silence, something that made her skin crawl. Then it spoke again, its words slow, deliberate, each one dripping with an unnatural coldness. "You think you can escape it? It's already inside you, Eliza. The phone is just the beginning." Suddenly, her phone vibrated violently in her hand. She looked down at the screen, and her blood ran cold. The picture had changed. It was a photo of her, sitting on the couch, her hand gripping the phone. But she had never taken that picture. She had never posed for it. Her breath caught in her throat. The room felt suffocating. The walls closed in as the voice whispered again, now frantic, as though it was right in her ear. "Eliza, I'm coming for you. You can't hide anymore. You're not alone." The phone line went dead. Eliza's phone screen flickered, and she saw a new message come through. This one wasn't just a picture, but a video. She hesitated, but curiosity won out. She opened it. At first, the screen was black, but then a figure began to materialize. It was her, standing in her apartment, but it wasn't her. This version of Eliza was cold, lifeless, her eyes empty, her face pale, twisted in a silent scream. She watched in horror as the figure on the screen lifted its hand, slowly turning toward her, its mouth opening in an inhuman smile. "Eliza, remember me now?" the figure said, its voice now unmistakably her own, but twisted, distorted, wrong. Before Eliza could react, the video cut to black. The phone fell from her hand, the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She stared at the empty room around her, every corner suddenly feeling more oppressive, more suffocating. The darkness seemed to close in, and the phone, her phone, began to vibrate again. The figure on the screen was coming. It wasn't just a video. It was waiting for her. And somewhere, in the shadows, the voice whispered once more. "Do you remember me now, Eliza?"